You know, most people think that democracy means the people choose their representatives, and those representatives make decisions based on the will of their constituents. That elected officials debate, vote, and shape policy through transparent democratic processes. What a beautiful and tragic illusion that is. It took Agent Richard "Dick" Helms, and a classified operation so secret that even today most of its details remain buried in CIA vaults, to completely shatter that illusion and reveal a truth that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. My name is Marcus. You're watching Razor Edge. Before we dive into this powerful story, I need to ask you something important. If these impactful military stories resonate with you, please consider subscribing to Razor Edge and hitting the notification bell. This ensures you never miss our deeply revealing narratives, and it really helps us continue sharing these transformative stories with you. Richard Helms was 45 years old when he received the most morally complex order of his intelligence career. It was a cold February morning in 1962, and he was sitting in a windowless conference room deep within the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The Cuban Missile Crisis was still fresh in everyone's memory, and the Cold War had reached a fever pitch that demanded unprecedented measures. Helms, a veteran of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, had seen his share of morally gray operations, but nothing had prepared him for what Director John McCone was about to propose. "Dick," McCone said, sliding a manila folder across the polished mahogany table, "we have a problem that threatens national security more than any Soviet missile." The folder was marked with the highest classification level, and inside were detailed profiles of 12 United States senators. Not Soviet agents or foreign operatives, but elected American officials. These senators, McCone continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, are systematically voting against defense appropriations that are critical to our survival as a nation. Helms opened the folder and immediately recognized the names. Senator William Fulbright of Arkansas, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon, a vocal critic of military spending. Senator Ernest Gruening of Alaska, who had consistently opposed CIA budget increases. These weren't fringe politicians or radical activists. These were respected members of the United States Senate, men who had sworn an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. "Sir," Helms said carefully, "these are elected officials. They have every right to vote their conscience on defense matters." But even as he spoke those words, Helms could see in McCone's eyes that constitutional rights were about to become secondary to national security imperatives. McCone leaned forward, his expression grave. "Dick, in the past 18 months, these senators have blocked or reduced funding for 12 critical intelligence operations. Operations that could have prevented the Bay of Pigs disaster. Operations that could have given us advance warning about Soviet missile installations in Cuba. Their votes aren't just political disagreements. They're endangering American lives and national security." The room fell silent except for the barely audible hum of the ventilation system. Helms understood that he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just his career, but potentially the very nature of American democracy. What McCone was suggesting went against every principle of democratic governance, yet the logic was undeniably compelling from a national security perspective. "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" Helms asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. McCone stood and walked to a large map of the United States hanging on the wall. Red pins marked various CIA installations and operations across the country. "We're proposing Operation BLACKBIRD," he said, his finger tracing invisible lines between the pins. "A comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation focused on domestic political targets. We need leverage, Dick. We need information that will ensure these senators understand the critical importance of supporting our operations." The euphemism was clear. They weren't talking about intelligence gathering. They were talking about blackmail, systematic, organized blackmail of United States senators. Helms felt a chill run down his spine. He had spent his entire career fighting to protect American democracy from foreign threats, and now he was being asked to undermine it from within. Sir, with all due respect, what you're describing is illegal surveillance of American citizens. It violates the Fourth Amendment, not to mention numerous federal statutes. McCone turned back to face him, and for a moment, Helms saw something he had never seen before in his director's eyes. Desperation. Dick, I've been briefed on intelligence that I can't share with you yet, but I can tell you this. If we don't secure adequate funding for our operations in the next 6 months, we will lose the Cold War. Not in some abstract, long-term sense. We will lose it definitively, and American democracy as we know it will cease to exist. The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Helms had dedicated his life to protecting American democracy, and now he was being told that the only way to save it was to violate its most fundamental principles. How would it work? Helms heard himself asking, surprised that the words had come out of his mouth. McCone returned to his seat and opened another folder. Inside were detailed architectural plans, technical specifications, and personnel files. We've identified key locations where these senators conduct their private business. The Mayflower Hotel, where Senator Fulbright holds his weekly poker games with defense contractors. The Metropolitan Club, where Senator Morse meets with his financial advisors. Private residences, where they entertain lobbyists and foreign dignitaries. Helms studied the documents, his trained eye immediately recognizing the sophistication of the operation being proposed. This wasn't a hastily conceived plan. This was a comprehensive intelligence operation that had been in development for months, possibly years. We have assets in place, McCone continued. Hotel staff, club employees, domestic workers, people who have been vetted and recruited over the past 2 years. They're patriots, Dick. They understand what's at stake. And the recordings, Helms asked, though he already knew the answer. State-of-the-art equipment, miniaturized microphones that can be concealed in anything from flower arrangements to briefcases. We're not talking about crude wiretaps. We're talking about comprehensive audio surveillance that will capture every private conversation, every unguarded moment, every potential point of leverage. Helms closed the folder and looked directly at McCone. And if they refuse to cooperate? If we present them with compromising information and they still vote against our interests? McCone's expression hardened. Then we escalate. We release the information to their political opponents, to the press, to their wives. We destroy their careers and their personal lives if necessary. The stakes are too high for half measures. The brutality of the statement hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about influencing votes. This was about the complete subjugation of Democratic opposition through fear and intimidation. Helms thought about his oath of service, about the Constitution he had sworn to protect and defend. He thought about the young soldiers dying in Vietnam, about the nuclear weapons pointed at American cities, about the delicate balance of power that kept the world from descending into chaos. And he thought about the 12 senators, whose only crime was exercising their constitutional right to vote their conscience. "When do we begin?" he asked quietly. McCone smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We already have. The question is whether you're going to lead this operation, or whether we'll find someone else who understands what's at stake." Helms knew he had no choice. If he refused, someone else would take his place, someone who might not have his experience, his judgment, or his moral compass. At least if he led the operation, he could try to minimize the damage, to find ways to achieve the objectives without completely destroying the democratic process. "I'll need complete operational control," Helms said. "No interference from other departments, no second-guessing from above. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right." "Agreed," McCone said immediately. "You'll report directly to me, and only to me. Your team will be compartmentalized. No one will know the full scope of the operation except you and me." Helms stood and gathered the folders. As he reached the door, McCone called out to him one final time. "Dick," he said, his voice softer now, almost paternal. "I know this isn't easy. I know it goes against everything we thought we stood for. But sometimes, protecting democracy requires us to temporarily suspend it. History will judge whether we made the right choice. As Helms walked through the corridors of CIA headquarters, the folders heavy in his hands, he couldn't shake the feeling that history would indeed judge them, and that the judgment would not be kind. But the die was cast, and Operation Blackbird was about to begin. Within 72 hours, Helms would have surveillance teams in position at 12 different locations across Washington, D.C. Within a week, they would have their first recordings, and within a month, they would make their first approach to a sitting United States senator with evidence that could destroy his career and his family. But what Helms didn't know, what none of them knew, was that they were about to unleash forces that would ultimately consume not just their targets, but themselves. The invisible hand that they thought would guide American democracy would instead strangle it, and the very freedoms they sought to protect would become the casualties of their protection. The most dangerous enemy of democracy, it turned out, wasn't foreign agents or communist infiltrators. It was the people who loved it so much that they were willing to destroy it in order to save it. 3 weeks after that fateful meeting in Langley, Richard Helms stood in the opulent lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, watching Senator William Fulbright shake hands with a group of defense contractors. To any casual observer, Helms looked like just another well-dressed businessman waiting for a meeting. But beneath his tailored suit, he carried equipment that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. Miniaturized recording devices so sophisticated that they could capture conversations from across a crowded room. What most people don't understand about intelligence operations is that the real work isn't done by glamorous spies in exotic locations. It's done by ordinary people in ordinary places, people who become invisible through their very ordinariness. And in the winter of 1962, Helms was building a network of such people that would penetrate the most private spaces of American democracy. "Mr. Helms?" A soft voice interrupted his observations. He turned to see Maria Santos, a 34-year-old housekeeper who had been working at the Mayflower for 8 years. To the hotel's wealthy clientele, Maria was practically furniture, present but unnoticed, trusted but ignored. What they didn't know was that Maria had been recruited by the CIA 6 months earlier, not through coercion or blackmail, but through a carefully crafted appeal to her patriotism. "Maria," Helms said quietly, "how are the installations proceeding?" She glanced around nervously before responding. "Room 1247 is complete. The microphones are installed in the lamp base and behind the mirror in the bathroom. The poker room on the mezzanine level was more challenging, but we managed to place devices in the chandelier and inside the card table itself." Helms nodded approvingly. The technical team had done exceptional work. The microphones were no larger than shirt buttons, powered by batteries that could last for weeks, and capable of transmitting to receivers up to half a mile away. More importantly, they were virtually undetectable unless someone knew exactly what to look for. "And the staff?" Helms asked. "Carlos in room service, Janet at the front desk, and Michael in valet parking are all in position," Maria replied. "They understand their roles and the importance of discretion." What Maria didn't say, what none of the recruited assets knew, was the true scope of Operation Blackbird. Each of them had been told they were helping to monitor potential foreign agents or suspected communist sympathizers. They believed they were protecting their country from external threats, not spying on their own elected officials. Helms walked through the hotel's corridors, mentally cataloging the surveillance network they had constructed. In addition to the Mayflower, they had similar operations running at the Metropolitan Club, the University Club, and the Cosmos Club, all exclusive establishments where Washington's political elite conducted their most private business. But the crown jewel of their surveillance network was something far more audacious. 2 days later, Helms found himself standing in the basement of a nondescript office building 6 blocks from the Capitol. The space had been rented under a shell company and converted into a sophisticated listening post that would have impressed the most paranoid Soviet intelligence officer. Banks of recording equipment lined the walls, each device connected to receivers tuned to specific frequencies. Maps of Washington covered every available surface, marked with colored pins indicating surveillance locations and target movements. "Sir," said Technical Sergeant James Morrison, a 28-year-old Army Signal Corps veteran who had been recruited specifically for his expertise in electronic surveillance. "We're receiving clear audio from all primary locations. The quality is exceptional. We can distinguish individual voices even in crowded rooms." Morrison led Helms to a bank of monitors displaying real-time audio levels from dozens of locations. "This is the Mayflower poker room," he said, adjusting a dial. Suddenly, the room filled with the sound of Senator Fulbright's distinctive Arkansas drawl. "Told the president that we can't keep writing blank checks for these intelligence operations," Fulbright was saying. "The American people deserve to know where their tax dollars are going, especially when it comes to activities that may violate international law." Helms felt a chill run down his spine. They were listening to a sitting United States senator discuss classified national security matters in what he believed was a private setting. The constitutional implications were staggering, but the intelligence value was undeniable. "How many locations are we monitoring simultaneously?" Helms asked. 47 active surveillance points," Morrison replied. "We have coverage of 12 senators, 8 congressmen, and 23 support staff, including chiefs of staff, legislative directors, and family members." The scope of the operation was breathtaking. They weren't just monitoring the senators themselves, they were conducting comprehensive surveillance of their entire political and personal networks. Every conversation, every meeting, every unguarded moment was being recorded and analyzed. Morrison led Helms to another section of the listening post, where 3 analysts sat at desks covered with transcripts and photographs. "This is where we process the intelligence," Morrison explained. "Every conversation is transcribed, analyzed for content, and cross-referenced with voting records and public statements." Helms picked up a transcript from the previous day. It was a conversation between Senator Wayne Morse and his chief of staff discussing strategy for opposing a proposed increase in the CIA's budget. The transcript was marked with red annotations highlighting potential points of leverage: personal information, financial concerns, political vulnerabilities. "What kind of compromising material have we collected so far?" Helms asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. One of the analysts, a thin man in his 30s named Robert Chen, looked up from his work. "We have extensive recordings of Senator Fulbright's poker games, where he regularly discusses classified information with defense contractors who don't have appropriate security clearances. Senator Morse has been recorded making disparaging comments about the president that could be politically damaging if released, and Senator Gruning—" Chen paused, looking uncomfortable. "What about Gruning?" Helms pressed. "He's been having an affair with his legislative director for the past 8 months. We have recordings of their meetings at the Jefferson Hotel, including discussions about his voting strategy on defense appropriations." Helms felt sick to his stomach. They had crossed a line from intelligence gathering into voyeurism, from national security into personal destruction. But the operation was already too far advanced to stop, and the pressure from above was only increasing. "Sir," Morrison said, pointing to a red light flashing on one of the monitors, "we're receiving a priority transmission from the Metropolitan Club. Senator Morse is meeting with someone we haven't identified." They listened as the conversation unfolded. Senator Morse was speaking with a man who identified himself as a journalist from the Washington Post, discussing the possibility of exposing what he called illegal CIA activities on American soil. "If what you're telling me is true," the journalist was saying, "this could be the biggest political scandal since Teapot Dome. But I'll need documentation, proof that these activities are actually taking place." Helms and Morrison exchanged glances. Somehow, word of their operation was beginning to leak. They had been so focused on monitoring their targets that they hadn't considered the possibility that their targets might be monitoring them. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Helms said quietly. "How quickly can we prepare our first approach?" Morrison consulted a chart on the wall. "We have enough material on Senator Fulbright to make a credible threat. The poker game recordings alone would be sufficient to raise questions about his handling of classified information." Helms nodded grimly. They had reached the point of no return. Within 48 hours, they would make their first direct contact with a United States senator, armed with recordings that could destroy his career and his reputation. They would discover whether their carefully constructed network of surveillance and intimidation could actually control the democratic process. But as Helms looked around the listening post, at the banks of recording equipment, the walls covered with surveillance maps, the analysts poring over transcripts of private conversations, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had built something monstrous. They had created a machine for the systematic destruction of privacy and democratic accountability, and they were about to turn it loose on the very institutions they had sworn to protect. The invisible hand was about to become visible, and when it did, nothing in American politics would ever be the same again. What none of them realized was that in a small office across town, Senator Morse's journalist contact was already making phone calls of his own, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose not just Operation BLACKBIRD, but the entire shadow world of domestic intelligence operations that had been growing in the darkness since the end of World War II. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the network they had built to control democracy was about to be turned against them. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in March 1962. Senator William Fulbright was shaving in his Georgetown townhouse when his secure phone rang, the red telephone that only a handful of people in Washington had the number to. He wiped the shaving cream from his face and answered on the third ring. "Senator Fulbright, this is Richard Helms from the Central Intelligence Agency. I need to meet with you today. It's a matter of urgent national security." Fulbright frowned. He knew Helms by reputation, a serious, competent intelligence officer who didn't make frivolous requests. "What's this regarding, Mr. Helms?" "I'd prefer to discuss it in person, sir." "Would 2 p.m. at your office be convenient?" There was something in Helms's tone that made Fulbright uneasy. In 20 years of politics, he had developed an instinct for danger, and every alarm bell in his head was ringing. Very well, 2 o'clock. What Fulbright didn't know was that Helms had spent the previous 3 days preparing for this moment with the methodical precision of a military operation. He had studied every aspect of Fulbright's personality, his political vulnerabilities, his family relationships, and his deepest fears. The folder on his desk contained enough information to destroy the senator's career, his marriage, and his legacy. At exactly 2 p.m., Helms walked through the marble corridors of the Russell Senate office building, carrying a leather briefcase that contained the future of American democracy. He had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, considering every possible response, every potential objection, every avenue of escape that Fulbright might attempt to pursue. "Mr. Helms," Fulbright said, as his secretary showed the CIA officer into his private office. "Please, have a seat. Can I offer you coffee?" "No, thank you, Senator." Helms sat down across from Fulbright's massive oak desk, noting the family photographs, the awards, the symbols of a distinguished career in public service. In a few minutes, all of that would be under threat. "You mentioned urgent national security," Fulbright said, settling into his chair. "How can I help you?" Helms opened his briefcase and removed a manila folder. "Senator, what I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels. Before we proceed, I need your assurance that this conversation will remain completely confidential." Fulbright's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Helms, I'm the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I don't give blanket assurances about confidentiality to anyone, including the CIA. I understand your position, sir. But I think you'll find that confidentiality is very much in your own interest." Helms opened the folder and removed a single photograph. It showed Fulbright sitting at a poker table in the Mayflower Hotel, surrounded by 4 men in expensive suits. Fulbright glanced at the photograph and shrugged. "So? I play poker with friends. That's hardly classified information." "The men in this photograph," Helms said calmly, "are executives from Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. According to our records, None of them have security clearances above the secret level. Yet our surveillance indicates that during these poker games, you regularly discuss classified defense programs, including details about CIA operations that are compartmented at the top-secret SCI level. The color drained from Fulbright's face. Surveillance? What surveillance? You're telling me the CIA is spying on United States senators? Helms reached into the folder again and removed a small device about the size of a quarter. This is a miniaturized recording device, Senator. We've placed them in several locations where you conduct your private business. The Mayflower Poker Room, your favorite table at the Metropolitan Club, even your car. Fulbright stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is outrageous. This is illegal. I'm calling the Attorney General immediately. I wouldn't recommend that, sir. Helms removed a thick transcript from the folder. This is from your poker game last Tuesday evening. Would you like me to read some excerpts? Fulbright remained standing, but his hand moved away from the telephone. Go ahead. Helms cleared his throat and began reading in a monotone voice. The president thinks he can run these CIA cowboys without any oversight, but he's wrong. I've got enough dirt on their operations in Laos to shut down half their budget if I want to. That's your voice, Senator, discussing classified operations with civilians who have no right to that information. That's taken out of context, Fulbright said weakly. Here's another one, Helms continued. The Bay of Pigs was just the beginning. These intelligence agencies think they can overthrow governments without congressional approval. Well, I'm going to make sure they learn otherwise, even if I have to leak their operational details to the press. Fulbright sat down heavily. The implications were devastating. Discussing classified information with unauthorized personnel was a federal crime. Threatening to leak operational details could be construed as treason. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for over 2 decades, was suddenly hanging by a thread. What do you want? He asked quietly. Helms leaned forward. Senator, the CIA is facing critical budget decisions over the next 6 months. Operations that are vital to national security are being threatened by congressional opposition. We need your support. You mean you need my vote? I mean we need your leadership. As chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, your voice carries enormous weight. When you oppose CIA funding, other senators follow your lead. Fulbright looked out the window at the Capitol dome, thinking about the oath he had taken to protect and defend the Constitution. And if I refuse to cooperate with this blackmail? Helms's expression didn't change. Senator, we're not blackmailing you. We're offering you an opportunity to serve your country in a time of crisis. But if you choose not to take that opportunity, he gestured toward the transcript. Well, there are other people who might be interested in this information, such as, the Washington Post has been very interested in stories about security breaches in Congress. Your Republican colleagues would certainly find these recordings fascinating, especially with the midterm elections coming up. And I imagine your wife would be quite surprised to learn about some of the other conversations we've recorded. The threat was clear and comprehensive. They weren't just threatening his political career. They were threatening his personal life, his marriage, his entire existence. Fulbright was silent for a long moment, staring at the photograph on his desk of his wife and children. Finally, he looked up at Helms. What specifically do you need from me? Next week, there's a vote on supplemental funding for intelligence operations. The amount is $200 million, which will fund critical programs in Southeast Asia and Latin America. We need you to support that funding and to encourage other senators to do the same. And after that? We'll take it one vote at a time, Senator. As long as you're cooperative, these recordings will remain classified. If you're not, Helms shrugged. Fulbright felt a crushing weight settle on his shoulders. He had spent his entire career fighting for transparency and accountability in government, and now he was being forced to support the very secrecy and unaccountability he had opposed. But the alternative was the destruction of everything he had worked for. How do I know you won't release this material anyway, even if I cooperate? Because we're not interested in destroying you, Senator. We're interested in working with you. You're a respected voice on foreign policy, and we value your input. We just need to make sure that input is aligned with national security interests." The euphemism was elegant, but the reality was brutal. They were turning him into a puppet, a respected voice that would now speak their words instead of his own. "I need time to think about this," Fulbright said. Helms stood and closed the folder. "Of course, sir. But the vote is scheduled for Monday. We'll need to know your decision by Friday." As Helms walked toward the door, Fulbright called out to him. "Mr. Helms, do you really believe this is what the founders intended when they created our system of government?" Helms paused with his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, his professional composure cracked, and Fulbright could see the doubt and anguish beneath the surface. "Senator, the founders never faced the Soviet Union. They never had to deal with nuclear weapons or global communist insurgencies. Sometimes, protecting the Constitution requires us to temporarily set it aside." After Helms left, Fulbright sat alone in his office for nearly an hour, staring at the Constitution on his bookshelf. He thought about the young soldiers dying in Vietnam, about the nuclear weapons pointed at American cities, about the delicate balance of power that kept the world from descending into chaos. And he thought about the recordings in Helms's briefcase that could destroy his ability to serve his constituents. On Friday afternoon, Fulbright called Helms and agreed to support the intelligence funding bill. On Monday, he gave a passionate speech on the Senate floor about the importance of supporting America's intelligence capabilities in a dangerous world. The bill passed by a comfortable margin, but as he cast his vote, Fulbright couldn't shake the feeling that he had just participated in the murder of American democracy. The invisible hand that was supposed to guide the nation's decisions was no longer invisible. It was holding a gun to his head. What he didn't know was that his capitulation was just the beginning. Within 6 months, Operation BLACKBIRD would have compromising material on more than 50 members of Congress. The network of surveillance and intimidation would grow until it touched every aspect of American government. The first domino had fallen, and the sound of its collapse would echo through the halls of power for decades to come. 6 months after Senator Fulbright's capitulation, Richard Helms stood in the expanded listening post that now occupied an entire floor of the nondescript office building near the Capitol. What had begun as a targeted operation against 12 senators had metastasized into something far more sinister, a comprehensive surveillance and control network that reached into every corner of American government. The walls were now covered with organizational charts that looked like the planning documents for a military invasion. Red lines connected photographs of senators, congressmen, their staff members, their families, and their associates. Each photograph was annotated with codes indicating the type and severity of compromising material the CIA had collected. Green meant minor infractions, financial irregularities, minor ethical violations. Yellow indicated more serious problems, extramarital affairs, questionable business dealings. Red meant career-ending scandals, criminal activity, national security breaches, or personal behavior that would destroy a politician's reputation overnight. "Sir," said Technical Sergeant Morrison, approaching Helms with a thick folder, "we've completed the quarterly assessment. The numbers are significant." Helms opened the folder and felt his stomach drop. They now had active surveillance on 73 members of Congress, nearly 15% of the entire legislative branch. More disturbing was the breakdown of compromising material: 23 red-level targets, 31 yellow-level, and 19 green-level. They had enough information to destroy the careers of nearly a quarter of the people they were monitoring. "What about the success rate?" Helms asked, though he dreaded the answer. 97% compliance on targeted votes," Morrison replied. "Of the 47 specific pieces of legislation we've influenced, only 2 failed to pass with the margins we requested." The efficiency was staggering and terrifying. They had created a machine that could manufacture democratic consent with the precision of a factory assembly line. But Helms was beginning to understand that they had also created something that was rapidly spinning beyond their control. "Show me the Gruning file," Helms said. Morrison led him to a section of the listening post dedicated to Senator Ernest Gruning of Alaska. The 75-year-old senator had been one of only 2 senators to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, making him a high-priority target for Operation BLACKBIRd. "We approached him 3 weeks ago," Morrison explained, pulling up audio files on a computer terminal. The leverage was his relationship with his legislative director, Sarah Chen. Married man, affair lasting 18 months, meetings at the Jefferson Hotel twice a week. Helms listened to the recording of the confrontation. Unlike Fulbright's resigned acceptance, Gruning had fought back with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You people are destroying everything this country stands for," Gruning's voice crackled through the speakers. "I've served in government for 40 years, and I've never seen anything as corrupt and un-American as what you're proposing." The CIA officer conducting the meeting, Agent David Walsh, had remained calm and professional. "Senator, we're not asking you to betray your principles. We're simply asking you to reconsider your opposition to certain defense appropriations that are vital to national security. By threatening to destroy my marriage and my reputation, by using illegally obtained recordings to blackmail a United States senator, this isn't national security, this is fascism." But despite his moral outrage, Gruning had eventually capitulated. The recording of his final surrender was painful to listen to. The voice of an old man who had watched his principles crumble under the weight of personal consequences. "What about the expansion targets?" Helms asked. Morrison led him to another section where 3 analysts were working on what they called second-generation surveillance. These were the family members, staff, and associates of their primary targets, people who could provide additional leverage or who might become targets themselves. "We've identified 127 secondary targets," one of the analysts reported. "Chiefs of staff, spouses, adult children who work in government or media, business partners, and close friends. We're particularly focused on family members who might be vulnerable to financial pressure or personal scandals." Helms studied the charts and felt a chill run down his spine. They weren't just controlling senators and congressmen anymore. They were building dossiers on their entire extended networks. Wives, children, friends, employees, anyone who might provide additional leverage was fair game. "Sir," Morrison said, pointing to a red light flashing on one of the monitors, "we're receiving priority traffic from the Cosmos Club. Congressman Peterson is meeting with someone from the Justice Department." They listened as Congressman James Peterson of Minnesota spoke with Assistant Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach about what Peterson described as credible reports of illegal CIA surveillance activities targeting members of Congress. "Nick," Peterson was saying, "I've been approached by 3 different senators who claim they're being blackmailed by intelligence agencies. The details are too specific and too consistent to be coincidental." Katzenbach's response was cautious, but concerned. "Jim, those are extremely serious allegations. If there's any truth to them, we're talking about criminal violations of the Constitution on a massive scale." Helms immediately called Director McCone. "Sir, we have a problem. Word is spreading faster than we anticipated. Justice is starting to ask questions." McCone's response was swift and decisive. "Accelerate the timeline. We need to bring Peterson under control before he can cause more damage." "What do we have on him?" Helms consulted Peterson's file. "Financial irregularities in his 1960 campaign. Possible violations of campaign finance laws. His brother-in-law's construction company received several no-bid federal contracts that Peterson may have influenced." "That's yellow level at best," McCone said. "We need something stronger." "Sir, with respect, maybe it's time to consider that this operation has grown beyond what we originally intended. We're now surveilling and potentially blackmailing nearly 100 elected officials and their associates. The constitutional implications—" "Dick," McCone interrupted, his voice sharp with authority. "The constitutional implications of allowing Congress to defund our operations during the height of the Cold War are far more serious than any temporary suspension of normal democratic processes. We're at war, even if it's not officially declared. In wartime, extraordinary measures are not just justified, they're necessary. But Helms was beginning to understand that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The operation had developed its own momentum, its own logic, its own appetite for control. Each success created the need for more surveillance, more leverage, more control. 3 days later, they made their approach to Congressman Peterson. Unlike the senators, who had been approached in their offices with some semblance of dignity, Peterson was confronted in the parking garage of his apartment building at 11 p.m. on a rainy Thursday night. Agent Walsh emerged from the shadows as Peterson walked toward his car. "Congressman Peterson? I'm Agent Walsh from the Central Intelligence Agency. We need to talk." Peterson's hand moved instinctively toward his cell phone. "I don't have anything to discuss with the CIA. If you want to speak with me, contact my office and schedule an appointment." Walsh held up a manila envelope. "Sir, I think you'll want to see what's in here before you make any phone calls." The envelope contained photographs of Peterson meeting with his brother-in-law, bank records showing suspicious transfers of federal contract money, and recordings of phone conversations discussing the arrangement. The evidence was circumstantial, but damaging enough to raise serious questions about corruption. "What do you want?" Peterson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We want you to stop asking questions about CIA activities," Walsh said simply. "We want you to withdraw your request for a Justice Department investigation. And we want you to support the Intelligence Authorization Bill that's coming up for a vote next month." Peterson looked at the photographs in his hands, images that could destroy his career and potentially send him to prison. "And if I refuse? Then these materials will be delivered to the Washington Post, the FBI, and the House Ethics Committee tomorrow morning. Your political career will be over, and you'll likely face federal criminal charges." The next morning, Peterson called the Justice Department and withdrew his request for an investigation, citing insufficient evidence and more pressing legislative priorities. By the end of 1962, Operation BLACKBIRD had achieved something unprecedented in American history: the systematic compromise and control of a significant portion of the United States Congress. They had files on 73 members of the House and Senate, active surveillance on more than 200 government officials and their associates, and a success rate that approached 100% on targeted legislation. But the monster they had created was beginning to consume its creators. The operation required constant expansion to maintain its effectiveness. Each new target created new vulnerabilities, new security risks, new potential exposure points. The network of surveillance and blackmail had become so complex that even Helms was losing track of all the moving parts. More troubling was the psychological toll on the operatives themselves. Agent Walsh had begun drinking heavily and talking about requesting a transfer to overseas operations. Several of the technical staff had developed stress-related health problems. The analysts who spent their days listening to private conversations and cataloging personal secrets were showing signs of severe depression and anxiety. And in the deepest, darkest corner of his mind, Helms was beginning to suspect that they had not saved American democracy. They had murdered it. The invisible hand that was supposed to guide the nation's decisions had become a fist that crushed anyone who dared to oppose it. But there was no going back now. The operation had achieved a momentum of its own, and the only choice was to keep moving forward, deeper into the darkness they had created, until either they controlled everything or everything collapsed around them. The network had expanded beyond their wildest dreams, and their worst nightmares were about to come true. By the winter of 1974, 12 years after Operation BLACKBIRD began, Richard Helms sat in his study in Georgetown, staring at a letter that would change everything. The letterhead read, "United States Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities," what the press was calling the Church Committee. Senator Frank Church of Idaho was demanding his testimony about domestic surveillance programs, and Helms knew that the carefully constructed house of cards he had built was about to collapse. The irony was not lost on him. Senator Church had been one of their targets in the early days of Blackbird, but they had never found sufficient leverage to control him. Now, Church was leading the investigation that would expose the very operation that had tried to compromise him. Helms walked to his safe and removed a thick folder marked Blackbird Final Assessment. The numbers inside were staggering and horrifying. Over 12 years, the operation had surveilled 847 elected officials, their staff members, and their families. They had collected compromising material on 312 individuals. They had successfully influenced 1,247 votes in Congress, including declarations of war, defense appropriations, and intelligence authorizations totaling more than $50 billion. But the true cost was measured in something far more precious than money: the systematic destruction of democratic governance in the United States of America. The first crack in the operation had appeared in 1968, when Senator Robert Kennedy began asking uncomfortable questions about CIA domestic activities. Kennedy had been immune to their usual leverage techniques. His moral authority and political popularity made him untouchable. But before he could pursue his investigation, an assassin's bullet in Los Angeles had silenced him forever. Helms had never been able to prove a connection between Kennedy's investigation and his death, but the timing had been convenient enough to send a chilling message to other potential troublemakers. Some secrets were worth killing for. The second crack had come in 1972, when 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. What the public didn't know, what even most of the investigators didn't know, was that 3 of those men had previously worked on Blackbird surveillance operations. Their arrest had created a direct link between CIA domestic surveillance and the highest levels of government. But it was the third crack that had finally brought down the entire structure. In March 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh had published a story in the New York Times with the headline, "Huge CIA Operation Reported in U.S. Against Anti-War Forces and Other Dissidents." The story had exposed the existence of Operation Chaos, a domestic surveillance program that had monitored American citizens opposed to the Vietnam War. What Hersh didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Chaos was just the tip of the iceberg. Blackbird was 10 times larger, 10 times more sophisticated, and 1,000 times more dangerous to American democracy. Helms opened another folder containing transcripts from the Church Committee's preliminary interviews. Senator Church's questions had been precise and devastating. "Mr. Helms, are you aware of any CIA operations that involved the surveillance of elected officials of the United States government?" "Senator, I cannot discuss classified operations in an open hearing." "Mr. Helms, I'm not asking about classified operations. I'm asking about illegal operations. The CIA has no authority to conduct surveillance on American citizens, particularly elected officials." "Senator, everything the CIA has done has been in the interest of national security and with appropriate authorization." "Authorization from whom, Mr. Helms? Who authorized the CIA to spy on United States senators?" The question had hung in the air like a sword, because the truth was that no one had authorized Blackbird, not really. It had begun with a vague directive about domestic political intelligence, and had grown into a monster that consumed everything in its path. Helms thought about the casualties of their 12-year war against democracy. Senator Wayne Morse had died of kidney failure in 1974, but those close to him believed the stress of constant blackmail and surveillance had contributed to his declining health. Congressman Peterson had suffered a nervous breakdown in 1970 and never returned to public service. Senator Gruening had become a bitter, paranoid man who trusted no one and spoke to no one about his experiences. But the real casualties were harder to quantify. How many crucial votes had been influenced by blackmail rather than genuine democratic deliberation? How many wars had been authorized? How many budgets approved? How many policies implemented not because they served the public interest, but because they served the interests of an intelligence agency that had placed itself above the law. The Vietnam War had been escalated and prolonged with the help of congressmen who voted for military appropriations, not out of conviction, but out of fear. The CIA's budget had grown from $500 million in 1962 to more than $6 billion in 1974, funded by legislators who dared not oppose it. Covert operations in Chile, Guatemala, and a dozen other countries had been authorized by politicians who knew that opposition would result in personal destruction. They had created a shadow government that operated through fear and intimidation, and they had called it patriotism. The knock on Helms's door came at exactly 9 a.m. Two FBI agents stood on his doorstep with a subpoena requiring his appearance before the church committee in executive session. As he read the document, Helms realized that his own words from 12 years earlier had come back to haunt him. History will judge whether we made the right choice. History was about to render its verdict. The church committee hearings, when they finally became public, would reveal a catalog of abuses that shocked even the most cynical observers of American politics. Domestic surveillance programs, assassination plots, illegal experiments on American citizens, and systematic violations of the Constitution that stretched back decades. But the full truth about Operation Blackbird would never be revealed. The most damaging documents had been destroyed in 1973 when Helms ordered the shredding of more than 10,000 files related to domestic surveillance operations. The surviving records were so heavily redacted that they revealed almost nothing about the scope and impact of the program. The official conclusion of the church committee was that the CIA had engaged in excessive and illegal domestic surveillance activities that violated the constitutional rights of American citizens. New laws were passed, oversight mechanisms were established, and reforms were implemented to prevent future abuses. But the damage had already been done. For 12 years, American democracy had operated under the shadow of systematic blackmail and surveillance. Crucial decisions about war and peace, about budgets and policies, about the fundamental direction of the country had been made not through democratic deliberation, but through coercion and fear. In his final interview with the church committee, conducted in closed session and never released to the public, Helms was asked a simple question: "Do you believe that Operation Blackbird served the national interest?" His answer, preserved in classified files that remain sealed to this day, was both an admission and an epitaph. "Senator, we set out to protect American democracy from its enemies. We ended up becoming the enemy we were trying to defeat. We thought we could control the system without destroying it. We were wrong. The invisible hand that had guided American politics for more than a decade finally became visible in the harsh light of congressional investigation. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The trust between the governed and their government had been shattered. The integrity of democratic institutions had been compromised, and the very idea that elected officials represented the will of the people had been revealed as a carefully maintained illusion. Operation Blackbird officially ended on December 15, 1975, when the last surveillance equipment was removed from the Capitol Hill listening post. But its legacy would endure for decades. The techniques developed for controlling Congress would be refined and applied to other targets: journalists, activists, business leaders, anyone who posed a threat to the established order. The monster they had created in the name of national security had learned to feed itself, and it was hungry for more. As Helms closed the final Blackbird file and placed it in his safe, he reflected on the question that had haunted him for 13 years. Had they saved American democracy or destroyed it? The answer, he now understood, was both. They had saved the form of democracy while destroying its substance. They had preserved the institutions while corrupting their purpose. They had protected the system while betraying its principles. The invisible hand was finally at rest, but the damage it had done would echo through the halls of power for generations to come. And somewhere in the classified archives of the Central Intelligence Agency, the techniques and technologies of Operation Blackbird waited patiently for the next crisis, the next threat, the next excuse to emerge from the shadows and take control once again. The price of control, it turned out, was democracy itself, and once that price had been paid, there was no getting it back. The most dangerous enemy of freedom was not foreign agents or communist infiltrators. It was the people who loved freedom so much that they were willing to destroy it in order to save it. And in the end, they had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams and failed beyond their worst nightmares. The invisible hand had finally become visible, and what it revealed was a truth too terrible for most Americans to accept. Their democracy had been an illusion, their freedom had been a facade, and their government had been controlled by the very people who claimed to protect it. Operation Blackbird was over, but its children lived on in the shadows, waiting for their turn to shape the destiny of a nation that had forgotten how to be free.